Good morning, everyone. My name is Denise Perez Rivera, and I would like to tell you guys about the cultural profile project I did for this class. First and foremost, I would like to add a disclaimer. If I seem kind of like quiet or low, it's 4:24 in the morning right now, but we'll get through it. I would like to introduce the person who helped me with this project and was nice enough to answer the questions I had, even though they weren't fun. Well, they were, but not to everyone. Miss Chelsea Ha was nice enough. I've known her for a few years. We've been friends for a few years. She's currently 21 years old and studying child development. And as of right now, from what I understand, her family is a mix between like Chinese and Vietnamese culture, although there is a heavier influence of the Chinese side. But from what I understand, they speak Vietnamese and like understand it relatively well as well. And while she does have relatives that did come from Asian countries, her and her cousins were all mostly like born in California. So there's that. So the first thing I asked Chelsea is I gave her definitions of low context and high context, what they were and how they worked. And then I asked her, based on like your culture, what you grew up with, and like your family, how would you describe it? Without hesitation, she told me she would describe them as high context cultures, like without a doubt. And I understand because as we were talking, these are some of the key points I understood. She said there's a lot of unsaid things happening. For example, body language is a big thing in like communication, like it's half of communication right there. So it's like understanding like your body language, other people's body language, but what are you showing? Especially if you're seeing like families or friends, like if you're going to greet them, like kind of picking up those cues and like how are they saying it? Say you don't speak much, how do those few things you do say sound? And it's kind of things of that nature. So what is important to remember about high context cultures is nothing's explicitly said. So like you have to like depend on everything else, like to rely on everything else, which is the fun thing about it. And so then I asked her, you don't have to embody these, but based on what you've seen, what are some of the values your family has? And it's like, what are some of the things you see that they really try to like show you guys? And one of the first things she said was family. Like they're very, of course, being a collectivist culture, they're a very family-oriented group. And in Taka family, we also talk about the social hierarchy and how to a degree there's patriarchy, but not as much as before. But the social hierarchy concept does, from what I understand, root back to the Confucius days. So that's been in place for a while. Although, from what I understand, it's been loosening up over the years. So we'll see how it goes. And there's this idea of always wanting to keep harmony between the family members. Like, you don't necessarily want there to be conflict, especially when you're like always together or like trying to be with one another. You don't want any problems there, which is fair. And there's also this notion of like respecting your elders that I did put in a question mark because while it is something that has been taught in the past, it's not as heavily implied now. Like there is a certain respect for them, but younger generations are like coming to question, but like why? It's like why am I respecting the elder? Like I get that he's old, but like why is the utmost respect, which is fair. But you wouldn't be able to question that kind of stuff before because it's like no. Another thing she also talked about was eating etiquette, which I guess you can put under the value of courtesy. I just thought it was really funny how much can happen at a dinner table. Like you're eating, it's like how much is actually going on in that dinner. The table manners, like everybody should know, regardless of age. Like she talked about like how the no sticking chopsticks upright. I've been told is some kind of like bad omen or something like that. I didn't get clarification on that guy. I've been also told how sometimes there's like this notion of like the oldest eating first and then the youngest. And she was telling me about how like sometimes in tea ceremonies, the youngest would have to pour tea for like the oldest to the youngest. I don't know if this is done as much anymore. I'd love to hear if somebody does know. To the next point. Actually, before I do, in case I forget, at the same time, I asked her what are some things her family discouraged. Like you have your values, like what they try to input into you, but what are the things that are like stay away from that? And one of the things she talked about was like this idea of like individualistic ideals, kind of like straying away from the family or kind of like straying away from like what the family has done, which is, expected of a collectivist culture. She also talked about how they tend to want the kids to date in their Asian circles. Like, it's not that they have anything against other people, but they would prefer if they date with Asian circles. And I've had a previous partner's parent tell me that, And I'm like, okay, but that's another matter. So then I asked her, once a problem arises, when something occurs, how is it resolved? What happens? And she really drove home this point of saving face. Like, it's this thing about like people always keeping their face or saving other people's faces. And I'm like, you know what? That's understandable for a collectivist culture, especially when their method of resolution tends to be the process-oriented approach, which in a nutshell is like mutual face-saving behavior. It's like, I don't want to look bad. I don't want to make the other person look bad. So it's like, what can we come to an agreement with? So she described it as lowering one's self-esteem or being humble to appease the other party. But to me that sounded like accommodating. But like, that's me. That's how my brain works. That's how I was raised. We also talked about the social hierarchy in that context. Like, the example I gave to her was, say a student and a doctor were fighting. It's like, and say the student technically had the reason, but the doctor's of higher social standing. Like, who theoretically should get the right and the win there? Like, would they still try to appease both? Would they give the right to the person who had it, or give the right to the person who's like technically higher? It was a fun question we had with. Some things I didn't put in any of the categories because I thought they would be better expressed by themselves, or some of these. The thing about China being a collectivist culture as well as a communist party under the Communist Party is that they're very focused on group outcomes. It's a very group-oriented thing, which I think is understandable. And Chelsea also mentioned this thing, and I thought it was really interesting. She said being expressive is the equivalent of being loud, which is understandable given how they work. Because they're kind of like, I'm not going to say they're puzzle pieces, but they're similar pieces kind of like working along with one another. So if you're kind of like out there, you're not there, which makes sense. Like throughout this video, like after I'm pretty sure I checked it over, you're going to see like how many gestures and faces I make. Like if that's being considered expressive, then I would be super loud. And as I did mention a little bit on the past, traditions have become a little more relaxed in the West and the East as well, with Western influence over the years. So there is that. We'll have the joy of seeing how that changes more over time. And some things I would like to call out. I had a lot of fun doing this actually, because it's always fun knowing more about other cultures, even though they don't relate to your own. Because I always want to be able to talk to somebody regardless of like what culture they're from. Like, I don't want the fact that you and I think different things stop us from having a conversation, because then like what's the point of like talking? Like what are we able to talk for? So it's always fun doing these things. Other than that, hopefully everyone's asleep in this hour. Thank you for your time and have a nice morning. Shit. How do I stop this?